Hi, I'm Tony Northrup and welcome to my Photoshop video training. We're going to go over how to stitch together panoramas. A panorama is a process of taking multiple pictures of a single scene and then stitching them together to create one wider angle and higher megapixel picture. It's a great way to make a wide angle picture when you don't have a wide angle lens, and a great way to make a highly detailed, high megapixel picture with any camera. So let's jump right into it. So in Photoshop, I'll do File and Open, and I know it's 21 through 24 here. I can't see the thumbnails, but I would in Lightroom. So now you can see a sequence of 4 pictures, each one shifted slightly to the right, overlapping by about a third, and that's my traditional panorama technique. So you could see that you could layer these 4 pictures together and kind of make a big picture. It's not quite that simple, especially because no picture is distortion free. The corners always get smushed in a little bit, and if you were to try to overlap them, it wouldn't be perfect. But we can get it with the help of Photoshop to be perfect. Now the first thing you want to do is to make sure that the lens corrections are enabled. And Camera Raw will often detect your lens for you automatically and apply those lens corrections. In this case it did not. And the reason is I was using a Sony camera with a Canon body and an adapter, and for some reason it just didn't work that out. But I'll go ahead and select, so I can see up here, it's saying it's a Sony 28 to 70. My bad, it actually did detect it. I just needed to select the Enable Lens Profile Corrections. So I need to do that for all these pictures. So I'm actually going to shift click all those so they're all selected, and then just turn on Enable Lens Profile Corrections. Those will make the process of adjusting it much better. Now before I pull these raw files into Photoshop, I want to make any adjustments necessary, at least regarding the exposure. I want to make sure that no part of the picture is underexposed. And as I look at this picture where I'm shooting into the sun, I can see it's too bright here. So I'm going to select all the pictures by pressing Control A. You can see they're all selected. And that means any changes I make will be applied to all the pictures. So I'm just going to drag this down so I can see a little bit of detail in the sun. And you can see if I drag it down too far, then you get that, and that looks unnatural. I want it to blend in and still look natural without losing too much of that detail. Okay, so that's about as far down as I can go without showing harsh edges. I can always pull those blues down later as long as I haven't overexposed them. That's because I'm working with raw files here. So once they get pulled into Photoshop, I might not be able to recover all of those highlights, so it's better to do it in the Camera Raw. Now, as we start to look at the shadows in here, you can see that some of the shadows are now a little too deep. So again, I'm going to make sure I have all 4 pictures selected, because any changes I make to one picture in the panorama, I want to make to all the pictures in the panorama. So at this point, I'm going to raise the shadows up some, because I don't want to lose that shadow detail, and that shadow detail would be lost once I made the jump into Photoshop. Another way to do this is to adjust the entire exposure up. And I know we just pulled the exposure down. I'm actually going to adjust the exposure up and then go back to this overexposed picture, select all my pictures again, and this time instead of bringing the exposure down, I'm going to bring the highlights down. So that adjusts just the brightest part of the picture. It's better to lose shadows. If you have to lose either shadows or highlights, it's better to lose the shadows. So, okay, there we go. Looking at the histogram, I can see I've done a pretty good job. It looks like not much is really clipped here. It still looks pretty natural. My shadows are not completely lost. I've just tried to find the one single exposure that makes all the pictures look as natural as possible. And I'll be able to do more processing on it once I get into Photoshop. So now I'll click Open Images. Actually, what I'll do is I'll right-click these, and then I'll click Merge to Panorama. And this opens up the panorama editing process, and it's going to be slightly different if you're working with JPEG files. So this part is specific to RAW files, but when you are shooting panoramas, I strongly suggest you shoot RAW files. In particular, because you're shooting so wide angle, you will get massive dynamic range changes like we did in this scene, and raw files will really improve that for you. So you can see it's done a pretty good job of pulling everything together for me. It found where the pictures overlapped, it stitched it so it looks pretty natural. You can kind of make this bigger to see some more detail in your picture. Now, I will almost always go in and turn off auto crop. It's going to crop it so that no part of the image is cut off, but sometimes you didn't take enough pictures. Sometimes you didn't shoot wide angle enough. And I'll show you a trick in just a bit where you can actually fill in some of that missing information. Now, you have three options here: spherical, cylindrical, and perspective. And the technical differences can be mind-boggling. But generally, if you stand in one place and you move your camera up and down and left and right, you're doing a spherical projection, and the spherical projection is going to look most natural. So I generally just pick spherical, but if one of them looks better, just go for it. I'm clicking merge here, and now it's going to save it as one big DNG file. This is going to be a raw file with all that original data captured in it that I can then open up in Photoshop. So we'll save that with the default setting. Here's my stitched together panorama along with the unfinished edges. And I want to warn you, this actually took 2 takes because in the first take, the computer ran out of memory. This is four pictures taken with a 42 megapixel camera. So the software has to work with over 160 megapixels of data, raw files, each with like 14 bits. So it's a really, really big file. It took a lot of memory. To get it to work properly, I had to go through and close all other applications. So if you run into other problems, close all your applications. And if you continue to run into problems, you might have to reboot or even add more memory to your computer, though it'll probably get it done. So with that selected, I'll just open the image in Photoshop and we can do some finishing work, because it's not ever as simple as just stitching it together. When you stitch together a panorama, it might be good enough to put on Facebook or Instagram or 500 pics, but once you start to look closely at it, you're going to see a lot of problems. So let's just hide some of this away, and I'll hit Control-Alt-0 to zoom. Well, let's hit Control-0 to zoom in and just see how pretty this is. But at Control-Alt-0, holding down the spacebar to pan around, I don't know yet, but I bet as I pan around, I'll be able to see some sort of stitching problem. Maybe I'll zoom back a little bit. Well, I didn't see a single stitching problem there. We'll take a look at a picture in a second that does have stitching problems. For now, let's see if we can go in and fill in some of these edges. I'm going to use the magic wand tool, and I'm just going to select all the edges here. And then I'm going to press Shift F5 to pull up the Content Aware Fill dialog. Pick Content Aware here if you haven't already, and then click OK. What this is going to do is it's going to tell Photoshop to try to synthesize the edges. It's going to look at the surrounding picture and decide in this sky area here. It's going to say, I see this is all this shade of blue, that there's a gradient going on. I'm going to try to just extrapolate and fill the rest of that in. And so this will make your panorama bigger with not information from the real world, but just what Photoshop thinks is probably out there. And that can be terribly useful. This can give you a little more room to crop. And as you can see at this zoom, I don't see any flaws. It just made up what it thought the real world looked like, and I think it kind of nailed it. It actually looks pretty good, doesn't it? We can zoom in and check the edges, but looking up here, that looks just flawless. Looking up here, I don't see any problems at all. There are lots of things to look for in Photoshop, and I couldn't see any weird distortions where it merges together the different pictures, so that's common. I will say I do see sensor dust, and sensor dust like this is always a pain. It's super easy to fix. You can just use the spot healing brush and just kind of erase it, and it should heal it. You'll see more sensor dust on panoramas because if your sensor has 2 pieces of dust on it and you take a 4-picture panorama, well, now you have 8 pieces of dust. So you will have to go in and track it down everywhere. Dust is going to be most obvious in areas with low contrast, like a sky here. So just panning around, actually, I don't see anything else that's obvious. That sensor dust appears somewhere else in the picture, but if I can't see it, I don't care about it, right? It's good enough. So this panorama, I actually feel like it went really well and turned out really nice. As you prepare it for print and you go to crop it, you'll have to keep in mind that not every printing surface can print in every shape. So you might have to seek out a printing surface that can print in the shape that you want. I'll also say use the edges for some emphasis here. Subjects close to the edge of a panorama, the viewer will explore them more. So something like the sun that I want to be a prominent part of the picture, I'm going to move it a little bit closer to the edge. I also want to balance the two focal points, the sun and the tree here. So I'll do that by just using the cropping tool. I just press C to bring up the cropping tool. And just want to make sure those are pretty roughly balanced. So there we go. This provides a little bit better balance, and now I'm ready to save it. Now you'll notice that it pulled it in as a DNG file, which meant I could go ahead and do any editing in the DNG file that I could have on the raw files, recovering additional highlights and such. And that's really a really powerful thing, especially with a panorama where you might have too much dynamic range. From the moment I save it as a PSD file, I lose that ability. So now when I reopen it, all the raw data is not necessarily in there. So it's better to do as much of the highlight recovery and shadow recovery and exposure adjustments and even white balance adjustments as you can with that original DNG file before you go and save it as something that can support layers like a PSD file. So let's close this picture and open up a little more complex panorama. So this panorama is actually made of 8 images. I'm just going to drag these into Photoshop. You can see it opened them all up for me. Once again, I want to make adjustments to the entire set of pictures all at once. I am working with raw files here. Let me see if I need to pull these highlights down some. You know, I'm not bothered by those clouds being a little bit overexposed, so I think I will maybe just raise the shadows and drop the highlights a little bit, but the dynamic range isn't going to be a huge problem here. Oh, you know what? I forgot a step. I didn't select all the pictures. That's something you always have to do. So let's set this back to 0 and then select all of these. And now it's better for me to adjust the highlights and shadows a little bit. So we'll go ahead and merge those to a panorama. Actually, since the panorama tool works with the raw files, I didn't need to do that beforehand. Oh, thank you. It reminded me that I forgot to adjust the lens here. And in this one, you can see I'm shooting with the Canon 16-35, but I was using a Sony body. So here it's not going to detect it. So I'm going to manually select the lens that I was using. If you don't find your exact lens, pick a similar lens or even search the web and find a profile that matches perfectly. So now with the lens profile corrections selected, I can merge to panorama by right-clicking it. It's going to take a minute to process. And here's the stitched together panorama. You can see here it's not giving me the option of perspective, but I can choose between spherical and cylindrical. And of course, cylindrical looks terrible because it is a spherical panorama. Cylindrical would be if you vertically moved yourself or horizontally, it's like strafed, like slid sideways or vertically while you're taking the pictures. If you stand in one spot and moved you around, you could imagine the focal plane would form a sphere around you as you move. That's why it's called spherical. So again, I'll leave auto crop turned off because it's easy to crop later, and I'll click merge, and it's going to prompt me to save this new panorama. Again, I'm saving it as a DNG file, which means it is a raw file. It has all the original raw data. I can recover the highlights and recover the shadows and know that I'm not losing any information that the camera captured. This will take a minute. And in fact, depending on the power of your computer, it could take several minutes. Once again, make sure you don't have any extra apps open. So now that it's done, I can open the image in Photoshop and finish up my editing. So Control-0 to make it fit to the window. And here I can already tell that if I fill in the edges, it's not going to do quite as nice of a job. But nonetheless, it never hurts to hit Shift F5 and get Photoshop to do the content aware fill because it's easy. And one of the most common things I find with panoramas that I shoot is I want to crop it less than I end up cropping it. You always need to take more pictures than you think with a panorama. Always shoot wider angle because of the way when it stitches it together, it will shrink it in for you. And when you do the auto crop, there will be little edges like this at the top and the bottom, and you'll have to crop at the tightest point. So it never hurts to have too many pictures. But when you do screw it up, content aware fill is there. I will end up cropping this particular picture, but having that extra data can make life easier. Okay, so Control D to deselect that. And you can see now we have two suns. So that's not the way the world actually works. So I'll definitely want to make a mental note that I go in and crop out that second sun at least. Now, I'm going to zoom in quite a bit by hitting Control plus. And again, I'm just going to pan around the picture and look for distortions because there's almost always distortions at the edges of the pictures. And albeit, it actually turned out really nice. Now, once again, we have some visible sensor dust here in the sky, so hit the J key to bring up the spot healing brush and just paint over these things. And Photoshop just makes them go away. It's easier to clean the sensor, but you know, you're out traveling in dusty environments, it's just bound to happen. Now, we'll show you a trick. If you didn't do all the editing that you wanted to, you can go in and use the camera raw filter here to make some further adjustments. And you know, in this case, I might want to bring up the shadows here a little bit. And the camera raw filter will allow me to do that without really ruining the picture too much. So I'm just going to raise the shadows up so we get some more detail in there. And from here on out, it's editing it just like any other picture. I know I want to crop it, so I'm going to hit the C button to just crop that in. Make this look natural because my world has one sun. And actually, while I'm at it, I'll pull in the left side just so it's a little bit better balanced. You know, it's not real pro to have my own shadow in there, but at the same time, I think it's an okay part of the storytelling process. Throw in a curves adjustment layer. And that panorama is good to go. I'll save it and it will become a PSD file instead of a DNG. Now, I wanted to show you flaws in the panorama processing system where the different pictures came together, and neither one of those pictures happened to have that flaw. So let's take a look at another file that I happen to know does have flaws so you can see what they look like. Okay, so this panorama is actually a really pretty panorama, and at a glance, I don't actually see any errors. In fact, I had success with the picture until I went to make a large print, and I thought I should just double check by zooming in tight. And first, you'll see sensor dust here, and sensor dust. A lot of sensor dust in this picture. This one is made with a lot more photos. But look at this. You probably didn't see this, but look at the way the wall curves in here and then ends abruptly here. That's just because, for whatever reason, it stitched together the wrong parts of two pictures. And obviously, this is completely unnatural. So you need to go through and edit that. And it can actually be really time consuming. Now, what can often be the quickest way to do this is to just lasso this and once again, use our old friend, Content Aware Fill, Shift F5, see if Fill can help us out. Actually, you know what? That already looks a lot more natural to me. Let's zoom in. And the way the rock wall falls off here looks much better. It looks more natural. It doesn't end abruptly. I will say there are some cloning errors in here, and the way I'll fix that is by doing Content Aware Fill again. So let's once again just circle these things with the lasso. I hit the L key to lasso them. And Shift F5 again, clicking OK here. And so, in other words, sometimes you have to repeat Content Aware Fill, but with multiple passes, it often fixes it. I'm just looking for anything that looks repeated in this area. This, I know this is not natural, but it doesn't strike me as unnatural. So this is a massive file. I think it's like 180 gigabytes at this point before the cropping. And I can fix this little guy here. Oh. Couple bits of sensor dust in there. More sensor dust. Using the magic wand to once again select the border. I definitely want contiguous enabled for that. Shift F5. Okay, so filling in the edges looks pretty good. I can obviously see some flaws here. Time to call up our friend Phil. Shift F5. So there we go, another finished panorama with no obvious distortions. But always, before you get a big print, pan in to 1:1 and zoom around, because you will just almost always see some sort of error where two different pictures were blended together artificially. Actually, I can still see some little bits of smudginess here, so Content Aware Phil will do this, a good job of this. Cloning can do a lot of that, but check our other videos for removing distractions, because that's basically the technique. It's the same as actually removing a distraction. And when you get it done, it should look great. Thanks for watching my Panoramas tutorial, and please do check out the rest of my Photoshop video training series.